free parking, and they're like, "Oh, creative ways to get out of your ticket." And
I'm
she
willing
brought
to
up that
walk if
idea.
there was a free parking. Is there a free parking somewhere?
Not in UAA.
Yeah, not on, yeah, that's what I thought, because I'm willing to walk.
Evening after 7:30,
Yeah,
and Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is free parking.
every Friday?
Every Friday,
All
all day.
Friday?
We pay for so much. Why do we have to pay for parking?
I didn't know all Fridays were free.
Read the sign that says parking from Monday through Thursday.
Huh.
It requires,
Yeah, I'm on my third ticket.
okay, so, let's,
I'm kind of upward about
I
that.
have a 2-hour class, and that one 2-hour class is costing me more than.
let's focus on Kwame Apaya's article that I recommended you look at for the assignment. And I guess I have a good question I could ask you, really, is, do you, yes?
Sorry, do you have the password? Just so I can follow.
Yes, it is Quench, Quench.
Okay.
So the issue is identity, and he makes a comparison between, say, culture and civilization, talking about the nature of cultures being, if we think about it, do we have a American culture? A lot of people would like to think so. He says, yes, we do actually have one with regard to the elite who speak English, who are Christian, mostly Northern European in origin, etc. Right? So there is that, but that's, he points out, that's not the culture of the United States, that's the culture of the elite among those who are Americans, right? But there are a lot of other people, of course, not all speak English, lots of different other languages. So if you look at the history, of course, the first people here were natives, Indiana, in a sense, right? The Latin for natives. And they had their own languages. They're not Caucasian, etc. But then besides them, you also had the Spanish in the south, the French, coming into Canada primarily. Even further back, we can talk about the Vikings and so on. Japanese coming across the Pacific, the Zuni Enigma, if you're familiar with that book. Then we also had the Chinese that apparently visited but said, nah, went back, not interested. In fact, they were outlawed from traveling this far by their emperor. Go figure. But in any case, so we've got lots of other folks that we can think of as included. Plus we have the aliens in Area 51, is it? They've been here long enough to be, you know, naturalized citizens, I would imagine. So it makes the difference between culture, because there's lots of different cultures. One of the books that I remember reading not too many years ago was called American Nations. And this author makes up a kind of a pattern of 11 different nations, so to speak, that make up the United States. And those are based on the migrations from Europe of different groups. So like the Scots, for example, would be one. The Norwegians maybe would be another. The southern plantation owners, you know, etc. So if you, yes, have you not heard of this book at all? Yes. I mean, I think there's other books out there that say there's 14 groups and, you know, so on. But the neat thing about this book, as I recall, was towards the end, as he puts it all together, that reflects then on the way people break themselves up into voting blocks, so that we have explanations for why certain areas of the country are especially prone to be, say, Republican, and others Democrat, and things of that sort. So it's kind of explanatory that way, if you're curious how we ended up getting this kind of dichotomy, or more. I mean, there's really more groups than just two positions on that. And it's cultural. It's based on cultural differences and interpretations of what's important, the values in life, and all that sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting. So there's lots of individuals that will agree with Kwame Appiah that if we focus on culture in a way that enough people could all agree on what a culture is, we end up with a multiplicity of cultures that makes up the United States, not just one culture. But it narrows a little bit, he says, when we talk about civilization, that as a civilization we do have to have an agreement on certain values and things of that sort. He doesn't really do much with that in the short article that we have, but you get the sense that even though we have lots of different cultural groups, we're all kind of melded together because of the Constitution, because of the laws that we're all in agreement on for the most part. Of course, there's obvious disagreements on a lot of aspects of that. But then he goes on to point out that what really identifies us, our identity, is unique to each individual. So that he feels what's most important is really that we respect all of the possible identities we have. Respect people for the identities that they each have, and that's how we could all manage to get along. Does that seem to summarize the article as you read it? Yes?
Yes.
Feel like that's pretty much it. Now, it does certainly make sense if you know something about Kwame himself. His mother was a British noble, and his father was a noble from an African country. Which country was it? Anybody? Do you remember? I know, I've read it, I can't remember what it was. Was it Ghana? It probably says here. Ghana, okay. So Ghana. Who's a noble in an African sense because he was one of the leaders of one of the parties, so he was a chief, etc. So he comes from noble blood on both sides, but he was mostly raised in England, so he was schooled in England. If you listen to him speaking, he clearly has a British accent, etc. And he always starts his discussions by talking about the taxi cab drivers, asking him where he's from, because he doesn't look like he sounds, so he confuses people. And so he's very aware of the identity issue that people have when they try to figure out, where are you from? They're trying to pigeonhole him so that they understand his identity, because doesn't that make sense once you understand where someone is from, what cultural group, if say they're Roman Catholic or Lutheran, or right, that gives you like a way of guessing what they think. Does that make sense? In fact, we could ask that as the quiz question, what's...
We're prejudicing them.
Pardon?
We're being prejudiced towards them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Going, right? Through profiling.
Yeah, we profile people all the time. We've got a lot of that as a national issue, especially police profiling people that they pull over and so on. I think I mentioned Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, right? Last class even, because I just read that, the week before, and it was pretty interesting. A big portion of that book was him talking about how police talk to strangers. You know, when they pulled somebody over, they're profiling that person lots of different ways, right? Examining the car, thinking about what the person looks like, whatever information they might have based on their driver's license and things of that sort, plus trying to decide whether or not they should check the car and see if they've got drugs or weapons and things of that sort. And of course, based on the record, an awful lot of police will pull people over for a certain profile, but they can easily misread that profile, and of course some significant clashes have occurred as a result of that. And Gladwell makes a point that police departments should train their officers to be aware of just how wrong they could be when they're using a profile to pull someone over, etc. One of the reasons I think he wrote the book, in response to the Black Lives Matter problem that we have currently. So in some respects, the same issue is part of what Kwame is talking about in his book, which, if you went and looked at the, you know, I didn't make a copy of it, but if I look up under videos, it was one of the more recent ones. Yeah, it's this one. This was the one I sent out as a possibility.
The world is now organized into 193 nations. Since the 19th century, all around the world, people care about national identities. So the big thing I think that people talk about when they talk about the modern rise of identity, I think the big thing that's happened started with the movements in the 60s. It was the rise of gender, and in the United States, racial identity, consciousness, and so on. And then the late 60s, after Stonewall, LGBTQ, as we now say, that's a shift. Identities. I mean, I think, you know, again, one thing that happened after the Second World War was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You'll recall that the beginning of that is grounded in the idea of human dignity.
I should ask about that. How many of you are familiar with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? One person? Two? Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt was really the motivating force behind that. She, remember, her husband had died. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died, the president, right? And it was and Truman was the president at the time. And she was chosen basically to organize this. She had a panel of foreign individuals from lots of different countries that she pulled together as part of the UN, and they ended up then creating this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which then was debated at the UN and passed by 190 some countries, right? So that's, if we look at that,
Were there 60?
60,
Entries in the document.
so here's the preamble. There's so you mean articles?
Yeah. Oh, 30.
30.
30.
And you would think, based on, so for example, Article 17, everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. And no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Keep in mind that, of course, that's male and female. You have signatories, countries that have signed this, that don't even have legitimate property that anyone in the country can own. You know, that's kind of an economics thing. Who invented property in the first place? The British basically invented it. The French also. It became the Northern European thing. Remember George Washington, one of the things we learned about him was he was a surveyor, right? You know, because that characteristic of the British law came over, of course, with the colonists, so that from the get-go, the United States, at least in the British colonies, not California, by the way. If you go to California, you notice the roads do not go straight. But if you go to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is a perfect example. All the streets run north, south, east, west, right? It's just, and everything was surveyed, and every property was basically recorded by the government, and you could buy it and sell it, unless, of course, the owner was the government itself, or et cetera, right? Same thing here. I moved here. It never occurred to me that there'd be a problem. I found houses for sale all over the place. I put my bid in on a particular house. The bank said yes, and we ended up eventually getting the deed, and we have, the lines on the map that shows exactly where it is, et cetera. That's a human invention. Not every country has that.
Wasn't that long before that, though? Way in the Middle East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Israel.
They had geometry, they had
the selling of lots and plots, right?
well, as far as I know, it was invented in the modern sense that we use it, where you can buy property and have a deed
Gotcha. With the forms and stuff.
with that whole, and
It's
where it's
recorded.
supported and it's recorded
Okay.
and it can be checked. That was kind of a British, French, Northern European invention, right around Elizabeth and after. So, in fact, I think it was Elizabeth that ended up with some problems where they began having poor people that weren't like members of a lord's estate, but actually people that were kind of like on their own in a community that didn't own any property, didn't have any place to go, and were like homeless. And Elizabeth was, where are all these people coming from? The reason that they were coming out of the woodwork basically was because the lords began mapping out their property and taking possession of it, instead of letting all of the people take wood from their forest and graze their animals, etc. Instead, the Lord started controlling it for his own profit, because that was a big change at the time, right? And so you had all of these people that were basically counting on all of those resources and now not allowed to use them, and no one occurred to them that if I take it, someone else is going to lose. And these people were all losing, and Elizabeth literally says, where are all these poor people coming from? Like, they didn't understand it. Yes.
Is that the same time frame, like to pull a contemporary example from cinema, the Robin Hood movie with Kevin Costner, where
He was earlier.
he was earlier because they were getting in trouble for poaching the king's deer.
Right,
So
well,
it's
that was,
land,
there's always forests and things where the sheriff would own the game, etc.
But
Yeah.
this became
The
more widespread.
poaching is a traditional European problem. But they could graze their animals on property that was not theirs. In fact, they didn't have property, but they had animals, so they had to graze them.
King Richard, I think, didn't it?
Yeah, that was,
So they had land and all that, and the lords, and William Wallace and all that kind of stuff.
Right, but I don't think they had the kind of property where like you could go,
I have deeds.
they did? But it's still, there are countries today that you cannot buy property that way. I don't know what Mexico has. If you can buy property in Mexico. But I know there were a lot of, like Peru, for example. There was a book called, I think it was called The Secret of Capital.
Yeah, I just saw a documentary somewhere, somehow, that some of these countries that don't allow private ownership of property, and these are really poor countries, and that they were talking and saying that, hey, you know what, if we allow these people that have lived here for 20 years, their families, to own this land, then we can start building capital.
Right, that's, this Hernando de Soto is, in this book, I believe he was talking about Peru. I read it quite a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure it was Peru. And the problem, and this is where I heard this for the first time, was that it developed in northern European countries as part of the way the government allowed people to have property. Once you have property, then you can go to the bank and get a loan with that as your basis for the loan, right? So you end up being able to build companies and increase your wealth because of this ability of the government to basically carve up the land and sell pieces of it to individuals that then own it and have certain rights that the government just can't take it away. But there are other places, like he was talking about in Peru, where if you thought you could go down there as a foreigner and buy a piece of land and start a business, you go down, you scope out where you want to build it, you inquire about the land, they tell you who can sell it to you, you go to them, you negotiate, you buy it, and then you start trying to work the land, and then all of a sudden someone else comes out and says, that person couldn't sell it to you, it's not his, it's mine. You buy it from him. And then someone else comes out of the, so there's actually no way, everybody's trying to take advantage of you, and the thing is, no one's going to actually let you have it because it belongs to the community. And the community doesn't own it in the sense that everybody has their own particular piece, depending on how much, so the whole situation is completely different, and as a result, you can't increase your capital because of the nature of the lack of the laws and enforcement in that country. So in order to have this kind of a business and grow your business and grow your capital, have escrow, all that kind of development, you first have to have the laws, and the laws have to be efficiently organized so that you have a process where you can find out who actually owns a particular piece of property and officially buy it, transfer the deed, etc. And only a few countries in the world actually have those infrastructure already in place. And changing a country like Peru to make it work that way is not an easy thing. Because when you look, as he talks about it in this book, Hernando talks about it, it took hundreds of years really for this gradually to evolve in a country. And so you can't just like say top down, this is the way it's going to be from now on, in a place that doesn't.
I mean, you can if you bring smallpox over and get rid of everybody who disagrees with that philosophy.
Well, that took hundreds of years, though.
Well, I don't think it took hundreds of years for the population to decrease, but yeah.
Another thing about that documentary, I'll try and find it and email the link to you. But the other issue they were talking about is because we have so many refugees in the last, 20 years or whatever, and a lot of these people are having really serious problems integrating into the United States culture. Even though they're allowed to keep most of their culture, of course, they're having problems because where they come from, there is no land ownership. And so they have this cultural thing where they don't value, because to them, land isn't worth anything. To us, it's worth everything. And so they don't have that same value system. And so it's kind of this clash of cultures. And it's a steep curve for them, of course. And so they kind of enter, that kind of is the exposition to the rest of it, whatever we're going to talk about, the capitalist part of it.
Right, right. Well, it's so if, oh,
I
Douglas?
was just gonna add to that, it seems there's a link too with the identity discussion here too, because it seems the identity of individuals that conform into this idea of Americanism, of United States under a declaration and a constitution, they seem to meld into this idea of what that means document-wise. And so it's easier for them to embrace capitalism and so forth, whereas other cultures that are more associated with tribes, clans, you name it, just people groups in certain regions that have been there for hundreds or thousands of years, whether it's Peru, I know that's the case in the mountains and so forth, and then you go to the Middle East and all that, they look to the cultures within their clan, within their tribe, within their region, and that's hard to change. You just can't go in there and say,
Right.
hey, do you wanna make money and really prosper? This is what you're talking about, flipping their entire life upside
Exactly.
down. And so now the struggle is, do we change what our ancestors have done for this, or do we keep this? Because many of those cultures, they honor their ancestors. And if you change something, wow, it could be a form of disrespect. There's just so many different taboos and cultural things that make them distinct, that this is a neat subject from a standpoint of trying to link the two from a thesis on the identity and this idea of the mystery of capitalism in the form of why it's so successful here and then not elsewhere. It's this identity thing that inhibits it, perhaps. You'd have to research it through, but anyway.
Well, I think there are a lot of folks out there, but, you know, finding those resources and understanding what's going on in the various countries, et cetera. This was an excellent source. I remember when I read it, I was astounded by how simple, complex, but you know, once this kind of property arrangement is set up and the government enforces it, and granted, you know, the situation in Alaska, a lot of the natives point out, we never joined Russia. I mean, who was Russia to sell us to the United States? We had nothing to say. This is our land, and you just came in, and I remember Willie Hensley in his book 50 Miles from Tomorrow, I think it is. Willie Hensley, sorry.
That relationship wasn't good to start, as I know it, right? Regardless of selling the land, right? Between Russians and the natives.
Well, that you know, the native groups were not involved in that at all. That was William Seward.
I'm not talking about the sale, I'm saying when the Russians were involved, that relationship with the natives was not very good.
Oh no, they were. But if you're familiar with Willie Hensley, who occasionally, I think, still does teach at the at UAA, if you have had a chance, he fantastic person. In this book, and I especially thought the one chapter was very philosophical, because he was involved in setting up the native corporations. And after that had been set up, he went back home and walking along the beach realized that this basically meant that the native culture was going to be radically changed by these corporations. And, you know, because you've got the tribe on the one hand, but then you have the corporation. They're not the same. You know, they're in fact usually two different groups of people that are at odds with one another, and they have different aims for the community. You know, the corporation wants to make money, and the elders and the tribe want to keep their culture intact, and those two obviously would conflict. So, for example, Pebble Mine, right? You'd have in the same communities, you'd have the corporation that would be all for Pebble Mine and the elders that were all totally against it, right? Because different aims, and
We
yet
have some corporations that have more than one tribe in them as well, right?
I'm not sure about that, but that could be.
Bristol
Well,
Corporation,
they were
I think that's at
fudging
least three.
what was what in creating all of that too. 250 villages, I don't know how many different tribes, but in any case, Willie points out when he was a child that his family lived they had like a winter home in the town, and then during the summer they would go out to fish camp. And so when the whites had moved in, right, into town, they all went out to fish camp for the summer, and when they got back, they found out that the whites had portioned up the town, sold the lots to the people that were there, who were all the whites, of course. And when they got back, they discovered that their house, which they had lived in for so many generations, was no longer theirs. It had been sold to a different family or person who basically said they weren't allowed to stay. So they just, their property was just literally taken from them and sold to someone else with no grounds for it whatsoever. So having the government set up this kind of deed process was clearly not done, at least in some of those places, I imagine all of those places, with the initial acceptance of the original natives of those places, because they didn't understand it. I mean, I guess the most famous example of this was the purchase of New York for $25 worth of beads, right? You know, something of that sort. You know, clearly the natives had no sense of what they were exchanging to the culture that was offering them the beads and saying, okay, so for this land, etc. Because from the natives' perspective, yeah, well, yeah, we're here, you're here, okay, you're going to give us beads, fine. They had no understanding that they were giving away and not being able to use it anymore to those that were giving them such trinkets in exchange for their livelihoods, basically. So yeah, when we think about how I don't want to go towards Zinn's book on the history of the American nation. What Zinn? What's anybody remember? History of America.
Talking about Howard Zinn?
Yeah, A People's History of the United States. When I was a kid, of course, that's not the way history was presented to us. It's instead the manifest destiny, right? The Europeans are absolutely God's chosen people. We came here and built, a perfect community, and went west. You know how the West was won, etc. No mention of starving the Indians and everything. The very first understanding I had of just how horrible some of that was the movie Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman. Any of you remember that? The way he was portrayed and portrayed General Custer and Little Big Horn, all that stuff. In any case, So I can't defend, of course, I'm not trying to defend, just describe that Western Europeans began a particular set of economic, cultural attitudes towards property that then they, of course, transferred along with their colonies to the United States. And we're economically solvent because that process was a way of improving economic opportunities for all those that were participants. They're certainly usurping the property from those that came before. Clearly it's a cultural thing and people can learn how to work with this and own property too. Of course, an issue for this is in order to buy property you have to have capital. So of course the people that have capital make more money by being able to own the property. And remember too, when we think about the end of slavery, the official end of slavery, a lot of folks would certainly argue that slaves are still among us and that we have more slaves in our country today than ever, although they're not officially slaves. They're just living as if they are. You might call them wage slaves or something else. But in a sense, there's a lot of people that are still indentured servants, so to speak, in our country. Even migrants, a lot of them come up here and, are not really free to do what they would like as citizens, but instead are under the control, maybe even locked up by those people that brought them, etc. But if you were a family that were freed and literally had no property of your own, and you're in a country where in order for you to begin making a living for yourself, you needed property, you're certainly still under the control of people that do have property. And so if they set wages for you that are far too little for you to actually make enough money to eventually buy your own place, you can imagine how the situation would persist. And that certainly has happened, that when we look at statistics on the comparative wealth of different groups in our society, it's pretty clear that groups that have had an accumulation of wealth from the type of culture and background that their families came from have continued to increase in wealth if they were successful. I mean, obviously some families are more successful than others. Seems to also skip a generation at about like the third generation. If you're familiar with the Trump family and others, the same kind of thing. The father makes lots of money, the son does okay, but the grandson is an absolute lazy bastard, kind of person. And then the next generation, they actually pick up where the grandfather left off or something, something. So there's odd social quirks, that apparently happen enough in families that it seems to be something there that persists. But if you're coming from a family that doesn't have any wealth and doesn't have any tradition of earning money, I mean, a lot of the cultural groups apparently survived because they found ways of avoiding the kind of labor that would kill off a lot of people. So it seems possible too, that a lot of people avoided labor because it seemed, there are cultures that do that. I understand that Arabic cultures traditionally working for a living is a sign of indentured servitude. That's not what any of the elite aspire to. Anybody familiar with that difficulty? you basically give a culture, by blowing up, their military leaders and say, okay, now you can have a democracy. And of course, it doesn't actually become a democracy. It instead ends up with tribal warfare, trying to figure out, okay, so now that he's dead, who of us can just basically take his place and end up, replacing Muammar Gaddafi, for example? Who's going to be the next, Gaddafi that basically will then make sure that only his tribe gets all the benefits? And of course, they're all fighting over that because nobody wants to let the other tribes have all the benefits. They all want all the benefits. So there's no unified country that's interested in having a law that everyone can follow, and an elected government that will be fair to everyone and enable them to compete in a merit-based competitive economy. No one's interested in that. They're not aware of how that could even work.
Because it's centralized around religion.
Their culture is, I think, based on
That's why they don't embrace a universal concept.
And collectivism, and collectivism, and value structures of collectivism versus individualist countries.
That was the distinction of our Constitution and Declaration.
one of the best examples of how to think of this comes, in my mind, from Francis Fukuyama talking about the changes that took place in European culture. There are certain stages that he depicts in his book, The Origin of I think I've mentioned it before.
Yeah.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
The book is the problem of getting to Denmark, where Denmark is actually not a real country. It's a mythical place that's non-corrupt, it's got a good government, it's responsive, it's democratic, and delivers services